I want to tell you exactly what my hands were doing the moment I realized my life had been stolen from me. They were shaking. Not from cold, though it was January in Detroit, and the kind of cold that seeps under doors and settles in your bones like it paid rent there. My hands were shaking because I was holding a court document with my late husband's name on a signature that his dead fingers had never formed. I was standing in the hallway of the church where we got married, 31 years prior, in my sunny yellow cardigan with pearl buttons, and across the potluck table, my stepdaughter Renata was smiling the way she always smiled, like she had already won, like she had already counted the money and spent it. I want you to hold that image in your mind while I take you back to where this really started. Because nothing that looks like betrayal ever announces itself as betrayal. It comes dressed as help. It comes in the form of someone who says, "Let me handle that for you." And by the time you realize what those words truly meant, you are already looking at numbers in a bank account that don't make sense and blaming yourself for not understanding. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January, the kind of Detroit winter when the cold keeps you inside and the windows fog up from the warmth of the radiator and the fresh cornbread cooling on the counter. I was 53 years old, alone in my duplex with a shared driveway and thin walls, and I could hear the muffled television from next door the way I always could, a steady hum through plaster and insulation that had somehow become the soundtrack of my days. I was wearing my sunny yellow cardigan with pearl buttons pulled tight around my shoulders, sitting in the living room with a shoebox from the closet spread open across the coffee table. I had been going through old photos. That is what I want you to picture. A woman in yellow, alone on a winter Tuesday, going through photographs. There is something painfully ordinary about it. I wasn't doing it out of grief, not exactly. I was doing it the way you do when the cold keeps you in and the house feels too quiet and you need to look at something true. The photos were from our early years here in the retirement community, the one with the community center and the benches out front where Gerald and I used to sit on Sunday mornings with coffee and styrofoam cups and talk about everything and nothing. There is a photo of him leaning back on one of those benches with his eyes half closed against the sun. He looks like a man who has nothing to worry about. The photo album with a cracked spine and faded pictures was open in my lap. That album had been on the same shelf in the same closet for 11 years. It held the version of my life that had actually been mine, before Gerald's stroke, before the second stroke, before the 22 months of grieving that had somehow turned into something I didn't have a word for yet. The hymnal from my mother's funeral sat on the end table where it always sits. I cannot throw it away. I have tried. I pick it up and I think, not yet. It has been 17 years since her funeral, and still I think not yet. I don't know if that is faith or stubbornness or just the particular way some things hold you. My phone lit up with Renata's name. I looked at the screen for a moment. The way you look at something you already know is going to be a problem. Transfer $20,000 today for Betty's wedding. Non-negotiable. Not a question, not a please. Betty was Renata's cousin, a woman I had met exactly 3 times. Twice at family gatherings where she didn't remember my name, and once at Gerald's funeral where she told me I'd held up well. $20,000 for Betty's wedding. Today. Non-negotiable. I set the phone face down on the coffee table. I looked at Gerald's face in the album. I looked at the hymnal. I looked at the cornbread on the counter, still steaming slightly, the kitchen smelling of something warm and domestic and mine. And I thought about the savings account that had started at $94,000 and was now sitting at $31,000, 14 months after Gerald passed. And how every time I asked about it, Renata had a folder and an explanation, and a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was being unreasonable for asking. I did not transfer the money. For the first time in 11 years, I froze everything. I didn't know yet what I was about to find. I didn't know about the forged signatures or the fake contracts or the LLC with a name I'd never heard of. I didn't know about Marcus or Dora or the cousin in Flint. I didn't know any of it yet. What I knew was that a text message had arrived demanding $20,000 with the word non-negotiable, and something in me, something very old and very tired and very done, looked at that word and said, no. That was the beginning of the end. And before it was over, I would discover that everything I thought I had lost to grief, I had actually lost to someone who was counting on me to keep blaming myself, keep listening. Because what I found next was worse than I imagined, and what I did about it was better than anything I ever thought I was capable of. Let me tell you what grief looks like when someone is using it as a weapon against you. It looks like a folder. Renata always had a folder. Every time I asked a question about the finances, every time I said, I don't understand why this number is lower, she would pull out a folder with printed pages, spreadsheets, highlighted lines, and she would explain it to me in the patient tone you use with a child who keeps asking why the sky is blue. She never raised her voice. She never got angry. She just explained, slowly and thoroughly, until I nodded and said I understood, because the alternative was to keep asking and feel stupid, and grief already makes you feel stupid enough. I want you to understand something about how this works, because I know some of you listening right now are sitting with a feeling you can't quite name, that something is wrong, that the numbers don't add up, that there is a conversation you've been avoiding because you're afraid of what it might say about you. And I want you to know, that feeling is not confusion. That feeling is intelligence trying to get your attention. I spent 14 months confusing intelligence with paranoia. Gerald had made Renata the financial manager after his first stroke. He had 2 daughters from his first marriage, Renata and her younger sister Yvonne, and he trusted Renata because she had a business degree from Wayne State, and because she was organized, and because, Gerald said, she knew how to get things done. I had no reason to disagree with him. I loved Gerald. I trusted Gerald's judgment. And when Renata sat across from me 2 months after the funeral and said, I think we should keep the current arrangement, just until you get your footing, I said yes. That was the word that cost me everything. Yes. What I didn't know then, what I was only beginning to sense on cold Tuesday afternoons in January when I sat with a shoebox of old photos and a number in my account that didn't match my memory, was that I had been selected. Not loved, not included. Selected, the way you select a lock that looks easy to open. I had stopped playing dominoes with my friends from church about 2 years before this. I know now that was one of the first signs. I used to play every Thursday afternoon at the community center, the one with the benches out front where Gerald and I had spent so many Sunday mornings. We'd play for 2 hours and then walk home, and I'd feel light, the way you feel after laughing with people who actually know you. But after Gerald's stroke, I stopped going because I was too tired. And after he passed, I stopped going because I couldn't explain the way I felt to anyone without crying. And eventually, Thursday afternoons became just another afternoon. When you isolate yourself from the people who knew your life before, you lose your witnesses. You lose the people who would look at you and say, something is different, something is wrong. I didn't understand that then. I understand it completely now. I was cooking for Renata every time she came to the duplex. Cornbread, usually. She liked it warm with butter. I would have it ready on the counter when she arrived, the kitchen smelling the way it always smelled when things felt normal, and she would come in and take off her coat and sit at the table and open her folder, and I would pour coffee and feel grateful that she was there, that she was handling things, that I didn't have to understand. Do you hear what I'm telling you? I was grateful. For the person who was robbing me. I cooked her cornbread and poured her coffee and thanked her for managing my own money. The self-blame is what made it possible. I had decided at some fundamental level that I was not capable, that my grief had made me emotional and unreliable and confused. Every withdrawal I couldn't account for, I blamed on my foggy memory. Every missing bank statement I blamed on my disorganization. When she showed me the spreadsheet that explained how $47,000 had moved into something called a Consolidated Estate Management LLC, I didn't ask what that was. I nodded. I assumed she was right and I was missing something. I assumed I must have agreed to it at some point and forgotten. That is the architecture of gaslighting. It doesn't require screaming or threats. It requires only that you already believe somewhere deep down that you are the unreliable one. And then it feeds that belief carefully over months and years until you have replaced your own memory with their version of events. I had ignored my health for 2 years by this point. The fatigue that came every morning, the chest tightness when I opened the bank app, the headaches that arrived like clockwork every time I tried to reconcile the numbers in my head with the numbers on the page. I stopped seeing my doctor because I felt guilty spending money on myself. I kept telling myself I was fine. I kept telling myself I would go next month. The hymnal on the end table caught my eye more than once during this period. I would reach for it sometimes when I was sitting alone in the evenings, not to read it, just to hold it, the way you hold something that belonged to someone who loved you without conditions. My mother would have known something was wrong. She had a way of looking at a situation and naming it cleanly before anyone else had found the words. I missed that more than I knew how to say. The cracks were small. A utility transfer I didn't recognize. A 3-day period where Renata didn't answer her phone. A moment when I mentioned to Gerald's sister Dora that I was thinking of asking for a full accounting, and Dora went very quiet in a way that I filed away and didn't look at again for months. I didn't look because I was afraid of what I would find. I was afraid of finding out that I hadn't been wrong about the numbers, that I hadn't been confused, that what I was carrying around wasn't grief fog, but actual, documented evidence that someone I cooked cornbread for had been systematically dismantling the financial security my husband had worked his whole life to build for me. The cornbread cooled on the counter. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. I was not imagining anything. The day I stopped crying and started hunting, I didn't feel brave. I felt cold. Not cold like the Detroit January cold outside, the kind that frosts the edges of the windows and makes the driveway dangerous in the morning. Cold like something internal had stopped running. Like whatever furnace of hope and excuses and self-blame had been keeping me warm had finally gone out, and what was left underneath was clear and sharp and completely without mercy. I want to be honest with you about what changed. It wasn't a single epiphany. It wasn't a moment of cinematic clarity where I looked in a mirror and saw my own strength. It was much smaller than that. It was a Tuesday evening when I was looking at the photo album with a cracked spine and faded pictures, and I turned to a page I hadn't looked at in months, and I found a photo of Gerald sitting at this same kitchen table 2 years before his stroke, with papers spread in front of him and his reading glasses on, and I thought, he would want to know what happened to what he built. He would want someone to fight. I decided to be that someone. Not for me. Not yet. For him. I started with the bank records. Renata had always brought printed statements to our meetings, and I had always looked at the total and not much else. Now I sat down at the kitchen table with every statement I could find, every printout she had ever given me, and I spread them across the surface the way Gerald used to spread his papers, and I put my glasses on, and I started at the beginning. The numbers didn't lie. They never do when you're willing to look at them. There were transfers I had never authorized, not errors, transfers, regular, structured, to accounts I didn't recognize. There was a line item, repeated across 8 separate statements, for something described as estate management services, billed at $1,200 per month, charged to a separate account I hadn't known existed. There was a notation about the Consolidated Estate Management LLC that I had nodded through 18 months ago, and when I looked it up, I found that it had been incorporated 4 months before Gerald died, while he was in the hospital after his second stroke when he couldn't hold a pen without help. I felt the floor tilt under me. I sat very still for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and started writing down every question I could think of. The discovery didn't come from the bank records alone. It came from a phone call on a Thursday night at 11:18 p.m. from a number I almost didn't answer, Renata's younger brother Marcus. I had always liked Marcus. The way you like someone who seems uncomfortable in their own family. He had Gerald's quietness, Gerald's way of looking at his hands when a room got tense. He called me crying. He was crying before I said hello. And what he told me changed the shape of everything I thought I knew. He told me he had been in the room. He told me that the documents Gerald had supposedly signed 4 months before he died, the documents that authorized the LLC that moved $47,000 from a joint investment account into Renata's private structure, had not been signed by Gerald. Gerald had been sleeping, and Renata had used his hand. I have to stop here and tell you what that felt like in my body. Because I promised you I would translate this into physical sensation, not abstract emotion. It felt like something behind my sternum snapped. Not broke, snapped. The way a rubber band snaps when you've stretched it too far. That sudden release that simultaneously hurts and relieves. My vision went strange at the edges. My mouth tasted like metal. I was sitting in the duplex with the thin walls, and I could hear the neighbor's television, the same muffled channel it always was, and that ordinary sound felt obscene. That was my collapse. Not a scream, not a confrontation. The collapse was this. I had made a plate for Gerald's side of the table every single evening for 22 months, since the day he died. A habit I kept because I wasn't ready to stop. Because stopping felt like the last goodbye, and I didn't have the courage for it. That night, after Marcus's call, I set one plate on the table. One plate. And I sat down and looked at it and could not eat a single bite. I just looked at that single plate and understood exactly what kind of fool I had been, and it felt like the floor had turned to water beneath my feet, and I was only staying upright by the grace of the table edge under my hands. The photo album was still on the counter where I'd left it earlier. I picked it up. I looked at Gerald's face. The photo on the bench, sun in his eyes, nothing to worry about. And I thought, I'm going to find every piece of paper. I am going to understand every number. And I am going to do whatever it takes to make this right, even if the only person who benefits from it is the version of me that comes out the other side. The album felt different now. What had been comfort was now evidence. What had been memory was now documentation of a life that someone had tried to quietly dismantle. I closed it gently, smoothed the cracked spine with my thumb, and set it on the table next to the hymnal. Then I picked up the phone and called Gerald's sister Dora. I had a feeling she had been waiting for this call. Dora answered on the second ring. She said, "I was wondering when you were going to ask." If you have ever heard a sentence that retroactively rearranges 6 months of your life, you understand what that felt like. She said it quietly, without accusation, the way you say something you've been holding a long time and are relieved to finally set down. And then she told me about the letter. 2 months after Gerald's funeral, Dora had received a piece of mail at her house in East Point, a notification from the investment firm Gerald had used for the joint account, confirming a beneficiary change made in the last weeks of his hospitalization. Dora hadn't been listed as a beneficiary. She hadn't expected to be. What caught her attention was the signature at the bottom of the confirmation form, the one authorizing the change. Gerald Weston, in handwriting that didn't look like Gerald Weston's handwriting. She knew his signature. She had been his sister for 61 years. She had kept the letter in a drawer. She had kept it because she didn't know what to do with it, because Renata was Gerald's daughter, and she didn't want to start something that might tear apart what was left of the family. She had kept it because grief makes people quiet when they should be loud. She had been waiting, she told me, for someone else to start asking questions. I want to speak directly to you right now. If you are listening to this and you have a letter in a drawer, a document that doesn't look right, a number that doesn't add up, a signature that you're not quite sure about, please do not wait. Do not wait the way Dora waited. Do not wait the way I waited. The people who exploit grief count on your silence. They are banking on it, literally. If this story is reaching someone who needs to hear it right now, share it. Someone in your life might need these exact words today. I hung up with Dora at 1:40 in the morning. The duplex was completely still, the neighbor's television finally off, the radiator clicking quietly in the corner. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and I sat at the kitchen table in my yellow cardigan with the evidence spread across the surface. Marcus's account, Dora's letter, my own bank statements, and I felt the last of the sadness drain out of me and something harder pour in to take its place. This is the shift I want you to understand, because it is not the shift I expected. I expected rage. I expected the kind of fury that burns through a room and leaves ash. What I got instead was colder and more focused than that. I stopped thinking about what they had done to me and started thinking about what I was going to do about it. That is when Claudette came back into my life. I had played dominoes with Claudette every Thursday at the community center for years, before Gerald's first stroke changed the shape of everything. She and I had been close in the way women become close when they play games together regularly. Not deep confidence close, but rhythmic close. The comfort of a face you know will be there, of hands you've watched lay down tiles 1,000 times. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years. She came to my door on a Saturday morning, 2 days after Marcus's call, with a covered dish and a look on her face like she had already heard enough to know what was happening. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, right where Renata had always sat with her folders, and she said, "Claudette Marshall is not here to tell you to be kind. I'm here to tell you to be smart." She had been through something similar with her own brother-in-law 5 years earlier. Not forged signatures, that was new territory even for her, but unauthorized account transfers, a power of attorney used to liquidate savings, the whole architecture of exploitation that targets people after loss when their defenses are down and their trust is wide open. She had come out the other side. She had found someone who helped her. She pushed a business card across the table, an attorney who handled elder financial abuse cases, out of Midtown. She had worked with him on her own case, and she told me he was thorough, and he was careful, and he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. "You didn't cause this," she said, while the fogged windows turned the winter light gray and soft around us. "They picked you because they thought you were safe." That one sentence. I have turned it over in my mind probably 1,000 times since that morning. They picked you because they thought you were safe, not because you were weak, not because you were foolish, because they calculated that you would not fight back, that your grief would be big enough to hide behind, that your self-blame would do their work for them. I looked at the attorney's card. I thought about the $31,000 still in the account, the $47,000 in the LLC, the monthly service fees, the forged signatures, the beneficiary changes. I thought about Dora's letter in a drawer. I thought about Marcus crying at 11:18 on a Thursday night. I thought about the photo album with the cracked spine and the picture of Gerald on the bench with the sun in his eyes, and I made a decision. I called the attorney on Monday morning. I had no idea yet how many of us there were. But I was about to find out. The hardest part was acting normal. I need you to understand what I mean by normal. Normal, in the context of my relationship with Renata, meant being available, answering texts within a reasonable window, asking about her life in a way that communicated I was still oriented around her convenience, making cornbread when she came by, nodding at the folders, not asking the questions I was now desperately, furiously, methodically preparing to ask. I had become a woman in 2 layers. On the outside, 53, widowed, a little confused, grateful for the help, making cornbread. On the inside, building a case with 3 other people and an attorney named Howard Jeffries who worked out of an office in Midtown Detroit with a small waiting room and framed certificates on every wall and a legal pad always in his hand. Claudette came with me to the first appointment. She sat next to me and did not say much. But her presence was a weight I needed, something solid beside me to keep me from floating off into the panic of it. I laid out everything on Howard's desk, the bank statements, the LLC incorporation date, Marcus's account, Dora's letter. Howard asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. He wrote for a long time without speaking, and then he looked up and said, "This is not a gray area. This is financial elder fraud, and there is enough here to pursue." I drove home alone, through the gray January streets of Detroit, past the community center with its benches dusted with snow, past the church where Gerald and I were married, and I felt something strange happen in my chest. Not relief, not yet. Something more like a lock clicking open, the faint mechanical sound of something that had been stuck beginning finally to move. The alliance formed on a January Saturday. Howard brought us together at his office, me, Dora, Marcus, Gerald's cousin June, who had driven in from Flint, and Gerald's former neighbor Annette, who had been friendly with Renata for years and had recently discovered that a small mutual fund she'd co-signed with Gerald had been redirected without her knowledge. 5 people around a conference table with papers spread between us. A woman I didn't know by name had driven 2.5 hours through Michigan winter because someone had taken something from her. That detail moved me more than I expected. This wasn't just my fight. It never had been. We shared documents. Howard marked what was usable, what was verifiable, what would hold in court. June had emails. Annette had a voicemail. Dora had the letter from the drawer she had kept for 22 months. Marcus was willing to testify in writing. I had the bank statements, the LLC timeline, and the text messages Renata had sent me over the years asking for transfers. The tone of them, the non-negotiable language, the pattern of demand disguised as management. We were organized. We were quiet. We were coming. The liberation symbol happened on a Wednesday night, 10 days after Howard filed the initial fraud complaint. I had not slept in the center of the bed since Gerald died. I had slept on my side, my half, the way you do when a person is present next to you for so many years that their absence still takes up space. I had made my side of the bed smaller and smaller, inching toward the edge, the way grief pushes you to the margins of your own life. On that Wednesday night, with the complaint filed and the accounts frozen and the wheels of something just and irreversible now turning, I lay down in the exact center of the bed, not on my side, the whole bed, the full width of it, my arms out, my face toward the ceiling. I lay there in the dark and the quiet, and I thought, this is mine, this bed, this duplex, this money, this life, mine. I slept for 8 hours. I had not slept 8 consecutive hours in 2 years. The close call came the following Friday. Renata called me at noon, unscheduled. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing documents Howard had sent over, my glasses on, papers spread across the surface. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I picked up, because not picking up would have been a change in pattern, and I could not afford a change in pattern yet. She wanted to come by on Sunday. She said she had the quarterly report ready. She said her voice the way she always said it, organized, efficient, slightly impatient, the voice of someone who has decided they are doing you a favor. I said, "Sunday is fine. I'll make cornbread." I set the phone down. I gathered every document on the kitchen table, put them in the manila folder Howard had given me, and placed the folder inside the photo album on the shelf in the closet, next to the shoebox where I had been sitting when the text about Betty's wedding first arrived. If she looked, and Renata had a habit of walking through my house with the comfort of someone who considered it adjacent to her own property, she would see the album and the shoebox and nothing else. She came on Sunday. I made cornbread. I poured coffee. I nodded at the folder she brought and said, "I see, and that makes sense, and thank you for explaining that." She left at 2:15. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after, looking at the cornbread on the counter, listening to the muffled television through the thin walls and thinking about the difference between performance and power. I had just performed helplessness for a woman who did not know that her performance of competence was already under forensic examination. Sunday was the last time I was going to cook cornbread for Renata. By the second week of February, everything was in place. Howard had filed the formal complaint with the Michigan Department of Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit. The accounts had been frozen, all of them, including the LLC, which Renata had apparently not yet discovered because she had not yet attempted a withdrawal. She had sent 2 more texts since the Sunday visit, both about upcoming administrative needs. I had replied to both with brief non-committal answers. She had no idea. The plan for the confrontation came together around a detail I had almost forgotten. Every February, the church where Gerald and I were married held its annual winter fundraiser, a potluck dinner held in the fellowship hall, the same one where we had our wedding reception 31 years ago. Renata had attended this event every year since Gerald's funeral. Not out of faith, she didn't have much of that, but out of what I can only describe as social maintenance. The church community had known Gerald. They respected his memory. Being seen there, being gracious and present, was part of how Renata managed her public face. 47 members of the congregation typically attended, people who had known Gerald since before I came into his life, people who had watched me grieve, people who thought of Renata as a devoted daughter managing a difficult estate. I told Howard I wanted to do it there. He looked at me over his legal pad. He said, "I want to be clear about what serves the legal case and what serves your need for something else." I said, "Can it do both?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If the service of the documents is done correctly, in a place with witnesses, it cannot be challenged as improper. But the personal element, that is yours to manage." I understood what he was telling me. The documents needed to be served properly. The personal element, the 47 people in the fellowship hall, the potluck table, the church where we got married, that was not strategy. That was truth being spoken in the place where the most meaningful promises of my adult life had been made. And I wanted Renata to understand what that meant. I wanted her to feel the weight of the location, the same way I had felt the weight of every Sunday morning on those benches, every cornbread morning in the kitchen, every year of a marriage she had watched me give everything to. I drove past the church that week, on a Tuesday, just to look at it. The winter made everything gray-blue, the stone face of the building dusted with old snow, the parking lot empty at midday except for the pastor's old Buick. I sat in my car for a few minutes, and I thought about Gerald. I thought about the photo album on the shelf, the crack in its spine, the picture of him on the bench. I thought about what he would say if he knew. He would be furious. Gerald was a quiet man, but his quiet had a floor. Push him below it, and there was something iron underneath. He had built a life carefully, deliberately, over decades. Not a fortune, not millions, but a steady accumulation of savings and property and security that meant his wife would not have to worry. And someone had looked at all of that and decided it was theirs. I thought about the Lincoln Navigator in burgundy red that Renata drove. She had bought it the year after Gerald died. I had not thought much about it at the time. Grief shrinks your capacity for noticing things. But Howard had noted the timing, the purchase price, the account from which the payment had been traced. The Navigator sat in her driveway in Grosse Pointe like a declaration that she had won, that the estate settlement had gone exactly as she planned. I sat in front of the church and I thought, not for much longer. Claudette called me that evening. She had been checking in every few days, not intrusively, just the way a person checks on someone who is doing something hard. She asked how I was holding up. I told her I was steady. She said, "Steady is the right thing to be right now." Then she said, "You know what your husband would say if he could see you doing this?" I said I thought I did. She said, "He would say he always knew you had this in you. You were just the last one to find out." I went to bed that night and did not sleep for a long time. Not from anxiety, from something that had no clean name, the sensation of standing at the exact edge of a thing the moment before it breaks open, the held breath before the exhale. 2 days until the fundraiser. Everything was ready. The trap was set. The fellowship hall smelled like it always smelled, covered dishes and floor wax, and something sweet somebody had baked. The accumulated warmth of many people in a room that was built for exactly this kind of gathering. The long tables were set end to end with cloth covers, The folding chairs arranged in the comfortable, casual disorder of people who know each other well enough not to need assigned seating. The windows were high and winter dark, and the overhead lights gave everything that particular amber glow that makes church fellowship halls feel the same everywhere, like the same light was installed in all of them by the same hand. I arrived before Renata. I had wanted to arrive before her. I wanted to be already present in the room, to have spoken to people, to have set my dish on the table and stood in conversation with Deacon Willis and his wife, to have been, in the most ordinary and unremarkable way possible, already there, so that when she walked in and saw me, she would have no time to calculate. She walked in at 6:47. I know the time because I was watching the door. She was wearing a charcoal coat over a burgundy sweater, and she looked, as she always looked, like a woman who had organized the situation before entering it. She spotted me almost immediately. The yellow cardigan tends to do that, even across a room. And her expression did the small thing it always did when she was recalibrating, that brief settling of the features into something arranged and useful. She smiled. She lifted her hand in a greeting. I moved toward her through the tables. I had the envelope in my hand. Howard had prepared it. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but a formal demand letter and notice of pending legal action, with the account statements attached, the LLC documentation, and the signature comparison that a handwriting specialist had already reviewed and documented. It was 3 pages long. It had Renata's full legal name at the top. It was real. She was still smiling when I reached her. I held the envelope out across the potluck table. "Renata," I said, "this is from my attorney." The smile took a moment to process what had happened. I watched it change, not disappear, but reorganize, shifting from social to careful, the way a face shifts when the conversation suddenly requires a different set of muscles. She looked at the envelope. She looked at me. She did not take it immediately. "What is this?" she said. Not a question. The tone of someone who was hoping the answer was something manageable. "It's everything I know," I said, "which is more than you expected." She took the envelope. Around us, the fellowship hall continued its warm, ordinary business. Someone was laughing at the far end of the room. The deacon was filling his plate. The smell of green bean casserole was very strong on the left. Nobody was watching, and everybody was watching. That particular quality of a room where everyone is engaged in their own conversation, while also, with the peripheral awareness of people who know each other's business, aware that something is happening at the potluck table near the door. Renata opened the envelope. She read the first page. I watched her read it, watched the color change in her face. Not to red, but to something grayer, more internal. Her hands were very still on the paper. Then she looked up. "You don't have the standing to do this," she said. "You were never on the primary accounts. Gerald authorized all of this." "Gerald was asleep," I said. "Marcus was in the room." Something moved through her face that I had never seen there before. It was not guilt. It was not remorse. It was the specific expression of someone who has just discovered that the wall they counted on has a door in it they didn't know about. "You don't understand how estate management works," she said, and her voice had returned to the patient, explanatory tone, the one she used when she wanted me to feel like a child. "There are structures that I understand $47,000, I said. "I understand a signature on a document that your father's hand did not make. I understand 12 months of $1,200 management fees charged to an account you opened in his name 4 months before he died. I understand all of it, Renata. I am not confused. I was never confused. I was lied to by someone I fed." The room had gotten quieter around us. Not silent, but quieter. She took one step toward me and lowered her voice. "If you pursue this, you will destroy this family." "Which family?" I said. "The one that forged your father's name while he slept? Because that family was already gone. I just didn't know it yet." She straightened. She looked around the room. at Deacon Willis, at the pastor's wife, at 43 people who were now, without quite meaning to be, witnesses. And something in her calculation shifted. She folded the papers back into the envelope. She set the envelope on the table between us. "I'll have my attorney call yours," she said. "That's fine," I said. "He's been waiting." She picked up her coat from a nearby chair. She had just arrived, and now she was leaving. And everyone in that fellowship hall, everyone who had watched me grieve, who had watched her manage, who had nodded at the quarterly reports she gave at family dinners and believed every word, now had a reason to ask a question. She walked out. I stood at the potluck table in my yellow cardigan in the church where Gerald and I were married, and I let her go. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was a kind of terrible clarity, the feeling of a storm system that had been building for 2 years finally making landfall, the pressure releasing, the air going sharp and clean. I had told the truth in the place where I had made my most important promises. Whatever came next, I had done that. Claudette appeared at my elbow with a plate. "Eat something," she said. "You've earned it." The court proceedings took 4 months. I want to tell you those 4 months were easy, but that would be a lie, and I promised you honesty. There were depositions I cried through. There was a Tuesday in March when Howard called to tell me that Renata's attorney had proposed a settlement that would have returned only a portion of the funds. And I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the cornbread on the counter and thought about how much easier it would be to say yes and let it be over. Claudette talked me through that evening over the phone for an hour and 40 minutes. She reminded me that settlements below full restitution were exactly what Renata was counting on me to accept. She reminded me that I deserved what was mine. She reminded me that this had never just been about money. She was right. It was never just about money. It was about the 11 years of a self that had been quietly, systematically made smaller. The wealth Gerald had built was real and it mattered, and I wanted every dollar of it back. But what I wanted more than the dollars was for the record to be clear. For there to be a document somewhere with both our names on it that said, "This was wrong, this was done, and she is owed restitution." Not a private resolution, a legal finding. The judge ordered full restitution in April. $47,000 plus 18 months of compounding interest plus legal fees. The LLC was dissolved. Every account Renata had held joint access to was closed, and the funds transferred to accounts in my name alone. Her name was removed from the estate entirely. The Lincoln Navigator in burgundy red, the one she had purchased with funds the forensic accountant had traced directly to the unauthorized transfers, was listed as an asset in the restitution calculation. I did not see Renata's face when the order was read. She was on the other side of the courtroom, and I made a decision not to look. Not out of mercy, out of indifference. There is a difference. Mercy would have required that I care what she felt. Indifference meant that her feelings had simply stopped being information I needed to track. That indifference was the truest form of justice I experienced. The money was real and the legal victory was real, but the moment I understood that I no longer needed to know what Renata felt or thought or told herself about what she had done, that was the moment I was actually free. I found the photo album with the cracked spine on a shelf when I was beginning to sort through the things I would bring to the new apartment. I held it for a moment. It had been through 3 versions of itself in my hands. First, as comfort, in the quiet January afternoon before Betty's wedding text arrived. Then as pain, when I turned to a photo of Gerald and understood what had been done to him. Now it was something else. Not comfort, not pain. Evidence of continuity. Proof that I had been here, and loved here, and survived here, and was now choosing to leave on my own terms. I wrapped it carefully in the inside of a sweater and packed it in the box I was taking with me. I had found writing that winter. Not deliberately. I started keeping a journal the week after the court date because Howard had mentioned it was useful to document everything you remembered, and then I found that I couldn't stop. I wrote at the kitchen table every morning, longhand, in a notebook from the drugstore. I wrote about Gerald. I wrote about the fundraiser and the envelope and the look on Renata's face. I wrote about the plate I had stopped setting on the table. I wrote about the first night I slept in the middle of the bed. I wrote for every woman who had ever sat in a fogged window kitchen and stared at a bank statement and wondered what she had done wrong. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes with putting words on a page. Not because it resolves anything. It doesn't. The notebook does not give you back the 2 years. It does not undo the exhaustion, the chest tightness, the doctor's appointments I had missed, the dominoes games I had abandoned. But it gives those things a place to exist that is yours. It is yours in a way that the bank account was supposed to be yours and wasn't. Nobody can forge a signature on what you've written in your own hand. Claudette brought me a plant for the new apartment. A snake plant, she said, because they were impossible to kill, and she thought that was appropriate. We laughed about that for a long time, standing in my half-packed duplex with boxes around our feet and the fogged windows behind us. She asked if I was afraid. I told her I was more afraid of the version of myself that would have stayed. I had arranged to move to the city where my grandchildren live, to watch them grow up with the same kind of close, ordinary presence that I had always hoped to offer. It was not dramatic, as Final Destinations go. It was just true. A 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen that got morning light and a front step where you could sit in the summer and watch the street. A reasonable drive from my oldest grandson's school. A life scaled to what I actually wanted, rather than to what was expected of me. The night before the moving truck came, I drove to the community center one last time. I sat in the parking lot and looked at the benches, dusted with the last of the February snow, empty in the evening cold. I thought about Gerald and the styrofoam coffee cups and the Sunday mornings that had felt like enough. They had been enough. They had been, in fact, everything. I thought about the Lincoln Navigator in burgundy red that I was going to buy. Not for anyone else, not as a symbol of what I had recovered or what I was worth. Simply because I wanted it. Because Gerald would have laughed and told me I always did have good taste. Because sometimes liberation is not metaphorical. Sometimes liberation is a burgundy red Lincoln Navigator parked in your own driveway, paid for with your own money, driven wherever you decide to go. It is May now. The season turned while I wasn't paying close attention to it, the way seasons do in Michigan, where winter holds on past all reasonable expectation, and then one week everything is green and the light is different, and you realize you don't remember exactly when it changed. I am sitting in the kitchen of my new apartment, the one with morning light, and the windows are open and there is no frost on the glass. I am at a table that is entirely mine. I am writing this in longhand in a notebook that is almost full. I want to tell you what the last 4 months have looked like because I think people tell stories about justice and leave out the ordinary texture of what comes after. After is not a montage. After is a Tuesday morning where you have coffee alone and realize you are completely at ease with your own company. After is an afternoon at your grandson's school play where you sit in the 3rd row and watch a 7-year-old in a cardboard crown deliver one line with absolute conviction, and you feel something in your chest that is just happiness, uncomplicated, unearned happiness. After is playing dominoes on a Thursday afternoon again, finally, at the community center near the new apartment, with women you are only beginning to know. Renata has not contacted me. I did not expect her to. The legal process ended, and whatever existed between us was dissolved along with the LLC. I hear occasionally, through mutual church connections, that she is contesting portions of the order. That is her right. It is also her problem. I find that I can receive this information without any particular feeling, the way you receive a weather report for a city you no longer live in. The Lincoln Navigator is burgundy red. I drove it here from Detroit. I am not exaggerating when I tell you that I pulled into the parking space of my new apartment on moving day and sat in the driver's seat for a full 5 minutes before getting out. Just feeling the particular quality of something that is entirely yours. You pay for things your whole life. Income spent on others' needs, dollars absorbed into households and relationships and obligations. To spend money on yourself, not as an indulgence, not as a reward, but simply as an ordinary act of existing as a person with preferences, is a radical thing after years of erasure. I recommend it highly. Now I want to talk to you directly, not about my story specifically, but about what my story is made of. Because what happened to me has a name and a pattern and warning signs that are recognizable before they become a crisis, and I want to give you those. The pattern starts with small exclusions. You are told that certain decisions are too complicated for you, that you are too emotional to make clear financial choices, that someone else is better positioned to manage what belongs to you. These exclusions will be framed as care. They will sound like help. The person doing it will almost always use the language of love. I'm doing this for you. I'm protecting you. You have enough to worry about. The first warning sign is any arrangement where you do not have full independent access to your own accounts. The moment someone else holds the primary login, the forwarded statements, the financial correspondence. The moment your money goes through another person's hands before it reaches yours. You have given someone the infrastructure of exploitation. They may not use it, but you have made it available. The second warning sign is the emotional diminishment that runs alongside the financial exclusion. You are told you don't understand how money works. You are made to feel that your questions are a burden, that your concern is paranoia, that your instinct is grief fog. Gaslighting and financial abuse do not exist separately. They are the same operation. One removes the money, the other removes your ability to trust the signal telling you the money is gone. The third warning sign is isolation. From friends who knew your life before, from family members who might ask questions, from any witness to the version of you that existed before the arrangement began. And here is what I want you to know about how common this is. Research shows that 1 in 5 nursing home residents was neglected at least once per year. And that statistic represents only the cases in institutional settings, where there is some oversight, some staff, some structure. Financial abuse inside families is harder to see, harder to document, and dramatically underreported, because the person doing it is someone you love, someone you cooked for, someone who drives their Lincoln Navigator to your church's fundraiser and smiles like they've won. And while in countries like Mexico, law guarantees free legal assistance specifically to protect seniors from exactly this kind of exploitation, because governments have recognized that older people are specifically targeted, specifically vulnerable, and specifically deserving of legal protection, the same principle holds here in America. There are attorneys who handle elder financial fraud. There are legal aid organizations. There are state attorney general's offices with elder abuse units. You are not alone in this. The law is, at least sometimes, on your side. If you find yourself in an arrangement where someone else is managing your finances and you cannot independently verify the numbers, find an attorney. One meeting. That is all I am asking. One meeting with someone whose job is to tell you whether your concerns are valid. Because here is the thing I need you to hear. I was not confused. I was not too emotional. I was not grieving my way to irrationality. I was a woman being deliberately kept in the dark by someone who calculated that I would never turn the light on myself. I was not powerless. I was just the last one to know it. And when I finally knew it, when I sat in the middle of my bed for the first time, arms out, the full width of mine, the word that came to me was not victory. The word that came to me was mine, my bed, my money, my life, my name on my own accounts, my grandchildren in the third row of the school play, my cornbread on my own counter, my burgundy red Lincoln Navigator in my own parking space. Mine. I have thought a lot in these months about Gerald, about the life he built carefully over decades. Not a vast fortune, not millions, but a steady accumulation of income and property and savings meant to outlast him as an act of love. He would not have wanted me to spend his absence in grief fog, manageable and small. He would have wanted exactly this, me at a kitchen table, in morning light, writing it all down. I write every day now. I am writing for every woman who sat in a fogged window kitchen and stared at a number that didn't make sense and blamed herself. I am writing for Dora and June and Annette and Marcus, who drove through Michigan winter with a letter from a drawer and gave me the evidence I needed to stand at a potluck table in a yellow cardigan and say, "I know what you did. I am writing for you." Wherever you are listening from right now, I want to know. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from today. Are you in Michigan? Are you somewhere cold or somewhere the season has finally turned? And I want to ask you something honestly. What would you have done? If that text had come in, transfer $20,000 today, what would you have done in the first 5 minutes? Tell me below. There are no wrong answers. There are only honest ones. If this story touched something in you, if it made you feel seen or recognized or a little less alone in something you've been carrying, share it. Someone in your life might be sitting with a bank statement they don't understand and a silence they don't know how to break. This story might be the thing that helps them turn the light on. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories of women who were underestimated and who made that the last mistake anyone ever made about them, subscribe. Stay close. Because there are more of us than anyone counted on, and we are all, finally, taking up the whole bed.